Welcome to the Neuro Sage Pub Podcast. We are an educational community for those impacted by autism and a place where neuroscience meets compassion and where families, practitioners, and educators come to rethink what's possible. I'm Justin Barton, the host, and I'm happy to be here today with Dr. Kyle Daigle to kick off a conversation that I think is really important to address, especially for parents and caregivers navigating autism or neurodevelopmental challenges. This episode will be entitled The Brain Isn't Broken, It's Misunderstood. And we're diving into the neuroscience behind behavior, reframing autism from deficit to difference, and offering a new lens that empowers families to support their children with clarity and compassion. So if you out there have ever felt overwhelmed, blamed, or unsure of what's really going on beneath the surface, this one's for you. Dr. Kyle, why don't you just take a second here and share some of the common misconceptions about autism and neurodivergence that you encounter on a regular basis?
I'd say autism it's a lot of times it's misunderstood, right? Because there's no one size fit all for autism. And I can tell you that we have 3 locations in the United States and 1 overseas in Dubai. We never see the same autistic kid, right? And so there are certain kids that have the same kind of characteristics, but maybe one kid's nonverbal, one kid can speak, or maybe one kid stims, and then maybe one kid's higher functioning. I do not believe autism is a disease. I think that what it is, it's a collection of networks in the brain that basically some are connected, some are not connected. And the question is, why aren't they? And that's what we're going to address today. Another question is there a nutritional deficiency for autism? And I would have to say no, that there's a lot of underlying issues, and some of these kids have some deficiencies that are common, but there's not just one drug that's going to fix autism or correct it. Let's just talk about stimming, right? A lot of times that's just because a kid has autism. Right. And that's not an answer, is that there's actually something neurologically going on in the brain for a kid who is stimming. And we can discuss that today about the markers in the brain and what's going on for a kid who's stimming. And then I would say that there's a hierarchy of autism. And when you really look at the bottom half, you see ADHD. And then above that, you see autism, and then they no longer have, it used to be Asperger's. They've actually taken that off, but just so you know that you can actually start to try to take autistic-like symptoms, and you can, as you build the brain, you can actually lower some of those symptoms to where you can actually have an ADHD child.
Those are big, bold words. You mentioned stimming and some of the neurological things that may be happening in regards to that. First, let's define what stimming is for somebody who may not be familiar with that. And then let's talk about some things that you've discovered and you've.
Okay. So stimming is a form of involuntary movements. Stimming can go into hand flapping. You can see some of these kids will jump around. Some of these kids will put their fingers near their face. So stimming, all it is that the brain basically is not able to fully control a voluntary movement. Okay? So when we break it down from a neuroscience or a neurological perspective, we're going to start from the brain and work our way down. So inside the brain, we have an area called the frontal lobe, which is in the front side, and it controls our executive function. And inside of this area, there's something called the go and the stop button. It's also known as an area called the basal ganglia. Okay, so what happens is that the stop button, which is actually called a dopamine 2 receptor, is not working as good. The question is, why is that not working? And a lot of times inflammation from underlying infections or maybe something in the gastrointestinal tract or even the sinuses can get in through this barrier in the brain, and it can block this receptor. So what you can see is a kid can get overwhelmed and he can start stimming because the brain has to process all this information. And if the stop button doesn't work as good, then the brain's reaction is going to be, it's not going to control. All right. Or maybe a kid gets so excited And then that kid's natural response is that he wets himself. And it's because the kid got excited, but there was an area of the brain that he couldn't control. And maybe it's the abdomen, the genital area. Or maybe it's a kid who you take an iPad and a tablet from him, and the brain has to process it because he's enjoying it, and he internally gets mad, and then he punches somebody. The kid didn't intentionally mean to punch the person, a parent, caregiver, is that he couldn't inhibit himself when he was mad. And what's happening is we run so many labs. When I get a kid who's stimming, I can automatically tell a parent pretty much what are going to be the neurological markers. And we run a blood draw, and we actually run a blood draw for literally all these different markers inside the brain. And it always comes back positive in this situation. The next thing, how the brain comes down, is there's an area, it's called the cerebellum. It's basically where the brain processes all this sensory information. It controls attention, language, emotional control, and even muscle tone. And deep inside of that, what it does is there's these little cells that control a chemical called GABA. And GABA is a brain chemical. It's known as a neurotransmitter that gets rid of anxiety and it calms things down. And it's very sensitive to something called gluten, which is what all of these kids eat. So if a kid has a sensitivity, which means that his body creates a stress response to this one food, inside the body, the immune system, it's called molecular mimicry. It goes to this area of the brain and it attacks it. And it creates a little form of inflammation. And it prevents the brain from releasing this chemical called GABA that keeps the brain calm. Sometimes these kids, from when we run blood work, they actually have an issue neurologically to this receptor in the brain that can't inhibit themselves. The stop button doesn't work. And there's inflammation specifically targeting this area that releases the chemical that keeps the brain calm. And then sometimes these kids actually develop, it's called intestinal permeability. It's called leaky gut. The gut barrier is supposed to look like this. It's supposed to have these gates that keep it tight. And their gut, when we run stool samples, looks like this. So when they eat this food, it can pass through, and anything in the gut, you get a headache, you take a pill, it can migrate it's up to the brain, and boom, it could actually cause inflammation in the brain.
Man, that's a lot. And for someone who is hearing about this for the first time and going, wow, that's my kid, I can see how they would go, now what? So we're talking about the brain isn't broken, it's misunderstood. How do we start to understand those things in ways that we can actually make some progress in them?
I think that I always like to highlight that in this approach is there's no one size fit all, and the better educated that a parent becomes, the easier it is to understand what's going on inside the brain. Really, the question here is, what is really autism in the first place? And what happens is the brain only develops from sensory input to the environment. If you took a child and you literally put a child in a dark room and you never showed them colors, you never told them their name, you never showed them what, pizza was, the brain will not even register if you expose them to what that is, whether it's a color or whether it's pizza, because the brain only learns from what it's basically been trained. And what happens is our senses is what basically build the brain functions awareness of where it is in space. So that's the eyes, that's the nose, that's the tongue, that's the ear, and that's movement of the body. So when you look at these kids, what happens is they're picky eaters, right? Some of these kids have a hypersensitivity to sound, so they have to hold their ears. Some of these kids, they have poor posture. And so what's happening is the brain is taking all this abnormal input from the environment and then normal input. And what it's doing is it's creating chaos inside the brain, because the brain only learns from the environment. But if the environment is not properly stimulating the brain where the brain becomes symmetrical, then it starts creating normal networks and underactive networks, or hyper networks and underactive networks. And at the end of the day, the brain controls everything from your thoughts to your movements to your immune system to even how you detoxify. So a parent who just heard me say this is that if I can break it down and say, what's the easiest, kind of quickest fix to try to help a kid with self-regulation or maybe to stop stimming, it's actually finding some doctor who knows how to address anything inside the sinuses and the gut that's directly impacting the brain, because that's going to be one of the root causes of creating inflammation in the brain. Because you're not going to get in here unless something goes through the nose in here, something in the mouth goes to the gut, back to the brain. Okay. Now, the other thing is that the better balance a child has, the more that the brain basically can start to release this chemical called GABA that keeps the brain calm. I always use the analogy that a yogi will never blow a building up. And then if you go into a nightclub, the bouncer wants to fight every single person. And the difference between the two is the bouncer is this big muscled up guy that's flexed forward in a fight or flight stage. And then the yogi is doing tree poses and they can stand all on one leg. Their house can catch on fire and they wouldn't even care, right? Because their brain is actually has the capacity to self-regulate itself. And when you look at these autistic kids, what happens is they can't walk a balance beam. They don't really have good core strength. And these are functions of the brain that deal with self-regulation. So you can go into PT and you can go into OT and you can have these guys start working on balance and core strength. And that's going to make changes to physically start making the brain start to self-regulate itself.
Yeah, so there's a lot there, but I'm really enjoying this conversation. Let's talk a little bit about the perception that many have is, hey, my child has autism, there's a deficit there. There's something absolutely wrong here. And we talk about, hey, the brain isn't responding the way that it could if it's balanced and if it's even and everything. Let's talk about this from deficit to difference. What does that shift mean for the individual, for the families, when we can understand that a little bit more?
Okay, so let's use your classic kind of autistic kid. These are the kids that we're going to go very high level of, like super severe. These kids, what happens is they are typically closing their ears or they're wearing headphones, right? And if you look at the posture of that kid, the kid's head's tilted to the right. Look at all the pictures and the head's going to be tilted to the right. And there's two reasons for that. The brain will typically naturally tilt the head to the weaker side of the executive function called the frontal lobe, or there's an inner ear problem. And when you go back, how many of these kids had inner ear infections and had to do multiple rounds of antibiotic? The first antibiotic should have knocked it out. If not, then there's something else going on. The next thing is when you look at these kids' face, there's a line that goes from the nose to the corner of the lip. We call that a nasolabial fold. Most of these kids, the right side of their face is actually flat. And then if you watch the kid walk, the left arm does not swing at all. And the left arm is actually internally rotated like this. The thumb is actually facing towards the body. And then the right foot will actually flare out a little bit to the side. So there's physical observations that you can physically see in these kids. Now, again, this is not every kid, but this is a very large spectrum of most of these kids. So what's happening is the brain controls the body, and there's all these physical abnormalities. And the interesting thing about these kids that literally have the headphones on is that if you take a ball and you try to bring it close to their face, they cannot cross their eyes. And what happens is they become very sensitive, people trying to kiss them in the face. Because what happens is it's a deficit. If a kid can't cross their eyes and you try to force the brain into literally someone coming too close to the face, it drives a fear mechanism inside the brain, right? You're walking through the woods and you blood on the ground. What does it do? It freaks you out a little bit, right? Because your senses, your eyes, you smell gas or fire, your brain's triggered to run. You hear a gunshot, triggered to run. You taste something toxic, you want to throw it up, or someone pushes you too hard, you're ready to fight. So what's happening is if the brain, which is constantly checking on the environment to see if it's safe, if it's not getting normal input, then it's going to be wired up into a fight or flight state. So in saying that, if these kids, and then you look at their pupils, the black in their eye, they're this big, they're dilated. And the pupils dilate in a state of stress. So the brain can see any type of threat from the environment. And the bigger the pupil, the weaker the connection to the brain. Big right pupil, brake pedal, can't stop, get overwhelmed, start stimming, become impulsive. Then the other thing goes to the face. If the face doesn't have symmetry and the kid tries to chew, then the brain's going to get lack of input to the brain. And the interesting thing about personalities is personalities are a characteristic of the function of your brain. You have some kids that are really good at numbers and math and they can memorize everything, and that's a skill set of the left frontal lobe. Then you have some of these kids that want to do art, or maybe they understand social rules, or maybe they have very incredible comprehension, and that's a function of the right side of the brain. And if these two functions don't match up, or one side has a higher skill set, then what it does is it surfaces the parent as a major deficit. Maybe it's going to be behavior dysregulation. So if the brain only builds off of literally the environment and the senses, and then you see these kids are picky eaters, right? Really what it is these kids can't feel their face or their tongue. So when they put textures inside the mouth, it feels weird. It stresses the brain out. They want to put stuff into their mouth that's going to instantly dissolve. Breads, pasta, crackers, chips, cereals, right? They don't want the crunchy broccoli or the steak. They want things right because what happens is the brain doesn't feel very well. And if the brain basically, the right side of the brain, which most of these kids have a lot more underactivity, that deals with new things. And how many of these kids want to do the same thing? A parent has to literally drive the same exact way. And if they don't, the kid freaks out because the brain is stimulated into something new. And that part of the brain's not fully strong enough, and it doesn't have these proper connections to build it. It's very unique, man.
You and I talked about this, I think it was offline before we started recording. A parent is willing to do whatever it takes to try and make things as normal. We take our children to a specialist who gives us something to do. We come back once a week, we come back once a month, we come back every 6 months. What can a parent do in between those things to help support and make some progress?
I think that one of the best things about the internet is that there's something called primitive reflexes. These are baby reflexes that a baby goes through certain pattern movements that mature the brain. Most of these parents, what happens is back in the day, these kids sped up quite a bit. They were fussy eaters, right? And that's actually a neurological sign that the face and basically the throat muscles are weak. So as a parent, I always tell parents this. You literally look at your child and you literally take a picture and you split their face down in half because this stimulates the brain. Eyes, nose, face, ears, tongue, all right? So the goal is to try to literally make your child's face look symmetrical. So I think, and there's a lot of research that supports this in the literature, is that facial stimulation is incredible, right? So if I have a child who's nonverbal and I want my kid to speak, from a developmental standpoint, a lot of times the networks inside the brain, they're very immature, and the kid could be 7, okay? And the only way the brain's going to build is off of repetition and time and duration. So if my kid is not getting facial stimulation, he's nonverbal, how's the kid going to be able to speak if his brain doesn't know where his face and his tongue is? So that's a great thing, is that facial stimulation with like vibration, rubbing the face, it directly stimulates the brain, right? And I tell parents this too. If you go to dinner with your friends, you enjoy the night, right? And what you're doing is you're socializing and you're eating. You're stimulating your facial muscles. And when you stimulate the face, you release a bunch of serotonin. Serotonin is actually going to normalize the mood, and it actually literally calms the brain down. You take someone who actually literally has a fear of public speaking, and they get up on stage, and it might take them 2 or 5 minutes to get rid of all the nerves. And then all of a sudden, boom, they're talking to 2,000 people and they enjoy it after. And they're kind of like, why did I put myself through that before that? And then after that, it was like, not so bad. Right. And what happened is they were stimulating the face and it activate the brain. So parents, using it as example, as some things that you can do, primitive reflex, research, study. There's exercises that you can Google, you can YouTube, you can read all about it. And what this does is that these exercises are super safe, but they help build the foundation of the brain. And so in saying that, one of the easiest, fastest things that a parent can do to help build brain function is actually start with foundational primitive reflexes. That's the face, that's the hands, that's the feet, and that's the back. Those areas need a lot of sensory stimulation and they could start building better brain function.
And I love that. And I think that takes us into some of the ways that Neuro Sage Hub can be helpful in these places, because there are modules in there where you can see those types of exercises, those types of things and products that you can even purchase to, like the vibration on the face, the exercises that can be done to stimulate those things. Tell us a little bit about some of the things that you see in Neuro Sage Hub that is helpful in these types of situations.
I think that parents really kind of need to understand how the brain develops, right? And so I know a lot of parents want their kid to start to speak, and there's potential to get there. However, if you don't build the foundation, then it's very hard to get to speech. Or if you do get to speech, you just get these one words. You don't get like creative speech. You just get kids with echolale and just repeating words. So in saying that, the way we built Neuro Sage Hub is that we educate a parent to understand how the brain develops. And then inside of that, what happens is that we also navigate parents on how to actually do specific exercises that build the foundation of the brain that then allow you to eventually start building things on top. For example, like in order to get to speech, you have to have these primitive reflexes, the baby reflexes. The brain has to basically get rid of them. And then above that, you need hand-eye coordination. You need a kid to be able to start catching balls. And then above that, then we can start getting into better speech. The platform was built to really educate the parent to be able to understand how to build a child's brain. Because sometimes kids are doing certain therapies that are a little bit higher level, and the brain maturity level, not the chronological age of the child, the brain maturation of the child is still low. So you can't take a 7-year-old and try to rehab a 7-year-old with a 2-year-old brain.
These are very helpful things, and thank you for going through that. As we start winding this up, is there anything else on this topic that you feel would be very helpful for people who are listening, whether they be parents, whether they be practitioners or educators, to dive into this topic a little bit deeper?
Yeah, I think that parents need to understand that most of these kids, have it's called cranial nerves. It's the nerves that stimulate the brain, that some of them are very hyperactive and there's some that are underactive. And so most of these kids typically can't smell as well and they can't taste as well. And it's very important because think about if you eat food, right? Part of your digestive system works like this. You smell food, someone's cooking, and all of a sudden your mouth starts to salivate. And that salivation is producing something called enzymes that are going to break your food down. But then the brain triggers the digestive system to get ready to eat. So if you watch these kids, what happens is they don't typically smell the food. They put foods in the mouth and they don't chew. And if you don't chew your food and you have this food that goes into the gastrointestinal tract, it's like a bowling ball. And that starts creating stress because the food wasn't broken down. And then when the food goes down there, it distends the belly and these kids get bloated. And then that can lead into constipation issues. So I think it's very important that parents really need to actually start looking at their kids' facial features and start noticing that if the brain isn't getting proper input from the senses, then it's going to start creating developmental delays with inside the brain.
Thank you for walking through this stuff, Dr. Kyle. So as we wrap this up, if this conversation shifted something in you out there in the listening audience, even just a little, or if someone you know and love came to mind, please share it with those people that you feel would benefit from it. Also, please subscribe, follow, and share the Neuro Sage Hub podcast with your networks so you don't miss what's coming next and so that they can enjoy you in this amazing community. In future episodes, we'll be continuing to dive into these different topics. And I've got one more ask for you, and that's to go visit neurosagehub.com and join the platform. Explore the resources. Check out the products that were mentioned out here today. Check out these different exercises and things that are within that hub and become an active part of this community that's changing the way we understand our brain. On the next episode, Dr. Kyle and I will be discussing what practitioners can miss about sensory input. So come on back and remember, you're not alone and your child's brain isn't broken. Let's just keep learning together and help things come together. Thank you very much. And thank you, Dr. Kyle.